Well, good morning and welcome to Unity Spiritual Center, and a shout out to our online community. So glad you're all here with us on this beautiful, now rainy day. We are in week 2 of our series based on the book Jesus and Buddha, The Parallel Sayings by Christian scholar Marcus Borg and Buddhist monk and practitioner Jack Kornfield. Last week, we explored the parallels in the teachings of compassion, wisdom, and materialism. Today, we look at the comparisons of what Jesus and Buddha taught regarding the inner life, discipleship, and attributes. Both Jesus and Buddha were teachers of the way less traveled. You think of that phrase as a book by Scott Peck, but no, it's been around for centuries. And the way or the path imagery is central to both the bodies of teaching by Jesus and the bodies of teaching by the Buddha. The Buddha has enshrined within his way or path the 4 noble truths of Buddhism, the 4th of which is known as the Eightfold Path. Jesus spoke regularly of the way. In the book of Acts, the earliest name for the Jesus movement was actually called the Way. The Gospel of John takes this image one step further and speaks of Jesus himself as being the incarnation of the way. What Jesus and Buddha said and taught was remarkably similar on a lot of levels. And in both cases, the important thing to know was that they spoke and encouraged a new way of seeing your life experience, a new way of being in that life experience. And so teachings and language surrounding the word seeing or sight and light were central to Jesus' teachings. His parables commonly invited you into a new way of seeing. Also, for the Buddha, who is known as the enlightened one, points to the concept of a new way of seeing in his work as well. Enlightenment means seeing differently, gaining insight, clarity, awareness. So for these 2 prophets, teachers, wise men, they both taught about seeing and being as core ideas in their teachings. They both tried to bring about a radical shift of how people lived in their life experience, whether they were encouraged to see things differently, to gain a new perspective, or to be different in the world, how we expressed and experienced and acted for ourselves. So both Jesus and Buddha encouraged people to see and be in a greater way. Robert Brummett would appreciate that. Also, both of our paths involve similar psychological and spiritual processes of personal spiritual transformation. The way of the Buddha entails a reorientation from a life of grasping, holding on, trying to grab onto something. And we know that when you try to grab onto and hold on tight to something, it usually causes suffering. And so the Buddha taught that letting go of that nature to grasp and to grab and to hold tightly to life would be a liberation from that suffering. And so the Buddha invited his followers to see that life was not about grasping onto something, but a letting go. And to embark on that path of letting go as a mindset and a practice. Jesus did not generate a systematic set of noble truths as the Buddha did, and yet the images running through his parables, I don't know why I can't say that word this morning, not enough caffeine. The images running through his parables and teachings point to the same path, that those who emptied themselves and called themselves to be exalted would be emptied and release from their own high regard of themselves. Those who make themselves last shall be first, and those who are first shall be last. The Buddhist letting go and the Christian dying are similar process. Paul said in his writings that dying daily was the ultimate letting go of the outer world and oneself as an ego-based security. When we hold on to the outer world as our identity and center and security, it leads to what Buddha would call the suffering. It is when we let that preoccupation fall away and let go of that as who we are, do we allow liberation and enlightenment to be born within us. And so it is a letting go of what the outer believes is important, to embrace the inner life, the inner awareness. Can you, thank you. So there's a Buddhist born-again experience, as well as the Christian liberation through enlightenment experience. They both use the same experience in different language to explain the same personal evolution. And so it is an ethical evolution of this internal transformation that is a key idea for both. And the outcome of this evolution also is the same. It is an awakening of compassion. It is awakening into being a more loving person. The Buddha, who is often called the compassionate one, the central characteristic of being a bodhisattva is compassion. They are known for compassion. When the Buddhist monks are here, you will hear us talking about their expression and sense of compassion. So for Jesus also, his teaching allowed that same awareness to be born, but he would call it love. Love yourself, love God, love your neighbor. When you look at how you embody that, it is the same. So despite the differences in language and imagery, whether taught by the Buddha or taught by Jesus, they strongly resemble one another. And in their wisdom teaching, there's really no significant difference. In regard to the inner life, both Jesus and Buddha drew their lessons from the basic imagery around them, the farmland and the rural countryside. It was very simply phrased so that people could understand, but it was also filled with pitfalls, ones that the people would recognize in the language and the story. Jesus would point out that we could be surrounded and misguided by the malicious in search for the self, but there were pathways to awakening in all directions. In the book of Matthew, chapter 7, verse 15, Jesus said, Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves.
And from the Dhammapada, chapter 26, verse 12, the Buddha states, "What good is high-end clothing? While your inward state is a tangle, you polish your exterior."
And in the book of Mark, chapter 8, verse 35, Jesus said, "Those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it."
From the Majjhima Nikaya, chapter 72, verse 15, Buddha states, "With the relinquishing of all thought and egotism, the enlightened one is liberated through not clinging."
Regarding discipleship, Jesus and Buddha both gave harsh demands to their followers, to their students. And Jesus warned that if they put their hands to the plow, there would be no looking back. And the Buddha devoted an entire sermon to the dangers that could befall an initiate.
Master, it's overflowing. How do you expect to seek enlightenment if you cannot see beyond the cup?
One must see beyond the cup. So just as with New Thought Truth students, as we are learning and evolving and growing, once we are exposed to a new level of, I think it's starting again. Once we are exposed to the oneness with the divine, there is typically no going back to a life and an awareness and a mindset of separatism. Once we have experienced oneness in our meditation, we strive to regain that oneness on multiple levels of our life. And the universe will supply many opportunities for us to experience both oneness and separation. So it is not an easy task to contain for yourself the mindfulness of oneness. And yet, all of those obstacles in our learning are a deeper lesson for themselves. For the disciples of both Jesus and Buddha, among the obstacles to maintaining that faith was that food, clothing, and shelter were considered irrelevant. Both teachers instructed their followers to abandon their thoughts of personal pleasure and to security and to go and teach and not be concerned for what they shall wear and what they shall eat and if they will have shelter when nightfall came. As a result, some of the early believers lost their faith along the way. Our creature comforts can be important to us. And yet we know that they are not the most important thing. And so for the followers of Jesus and Buddha, they too learned this same lesson. Ultimately, each leader organized their disciples and sent them into the world to carry on the message after they were gone, so that the message could be spread far and wide beyond what they could do themselves. Just like how I say to you, knowing how to talk about new thought and unity is important so that you can share your level of understanding and enlightenment with others. When someone asks you, What is unity? We've had a class on that. How do you share your spiritual awakening?
From the Majjhima Nikaya, chapter 143, verse 15. Such talk on the Dharma is not given to lay people clothed in white, says the Buddha. Such talk on the Dharma is given to those who have gone forth.
And in Mark chapter 4, verses 11 and 34, Jesus says, "To you who has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything comes in parables. He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his inner circle of disciples."
From the Vitaya Mahabhaga 1.11.1. Teach the Dharma which is lovely at the beginning, lovely in the middle, lovely at the end. Explain with the spirit and the letter in the fashion of Brahma. In this way, you will be completely fulfilled and wholly pure.
And from Matthew chapter 28, verse 19 and 20, Jesus says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded of you."
From the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 7, verse 68, Buddha says, 60 more gave up the training and returned to the lower life, saying, "Hard is the task of the exalted one."
And from John chapter 6, verse 66, Jesus says, "Many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him." The question as to whether Jesus was a god or a man has been debated for centuries. Both he and Buddha were head characters of these denominations. In the eternal aspect of what it is, both human men were destined to die. And ironically, they prepared their disciples for that very human element, that very human event, by permitting them to witness the transfiguration of their body. Most religious texts portray each of them as remarkable in appearance, and most importantly, they were described as avatars who descend from heaven to serve humankind and eventually would return there. Yet in Buddhism and Christianity, they are each seen as fully human, but capable of miraculous powers. Each was born of a woman, but a chaste woman, and thus combines the humanity with the divinity. And so even in the story that we know in our own culture, know about the story of Jesus' birth, the story of the Buddha's birth is very similar, where it was a divine I'm lost for a word now. A divine intervention that allowed for Siddhartha to be born of such amazing attributes. In John chapter 8, verse 12, Jesus spoke unto them, saying, "I am the light of the world, and whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but I will have the light of life."
And from the Digha Nikaya 14.1.17, Buddha says, "When a bodhisattva descends from heaven, there appears in this world an immeasurable splendid light, surpassing the glory of the most powerful glow. And whatever dark space lies beyond the world's ends will be illumined by this light."
And from John chapter 8, verse 42 and 55, Jesus said, "I came from God and now am here. I did not come on my own, but he sent me. You do not know him, but I know him. I do know him, and I keep his word."
From the Digha Nikaya, chapter 13, verse 38, Buddha says, "It might be said that a man, on being asked of the way, might be confused or perplexed. But I know Brahma and the world of Brahma, and the way to the world of Brahma and the path of practice whereby the world of Brahma may be gained."
from John chapter 14, verse 6 and 9, and also verse 18 through 21. Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth and a life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Have I been with you all this time, Philip, and you still do not know me? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? I will not leave you orphaned. I am coming to you. In a little while the world will no longer see me, but you will see me because I live. You also have life. On the day that you will know that I am in my Father, and you and me, and I in you, they who have kept my commandments and keep them are those who love me. And those who love me will be loved by my Father, and I will love them and reveal myself to them."
From the Itivuttaka 3.5.3, Buddha says, "Even if a monk should seize the hem of my garment and walk behind me step for step, yet if he is covetous in his desires, careless and unrestrained, then that monkey is far from me, and I am far from him." What is the cause of that? Monks, that monk does not see Dharma. Not seeing Dharma, he does not see me, even though monks should dwell far away. Yet, if he is not covetous in his desires, not fierce in his longing, not malevolent of heart, not of mind corrupt, but composed, calm, mindful, and restrained in sense, then indeed that one is near to me, and I am near to him. What is the cause of that? Monks, that monk sees Dharma. Seeing Dharma, he sees me.
However, there is one major difference between Jesus and the Buddha, and that is the social political passion that Jesus had that is not as prevalent in the teachings of the Buddha. In the judgment of many Jesus scholars, in addition to being a wisdom teacher and a prophet and a healer, Jesus was known as a social prophet. He challenged the denominational system of his day and the ruling elites, and affirmed an alternative social vision. And this, as you know, made the leadership quite nervous. Jesus' activity as a social prophet, as a voice of religious social protest, is most likely the reason that his public activity was so brief compared to the Buddha, who had the ability to teach for close to 50 years. Had Jesus not been the type of social, political, religious activist that he was, chances are good he would not have been executed as he was. And so this difference between Jesus and the Buddha may reflect partially because of their social class. Remember last week I shared with you that the Buddha, Siddhartha, was born into a wealthy ruling class. He was born a prince, while Jesus was born a carpenter's son into the impoverished class of a peasant. It is John Dominic Crossan, who is a premier Jesus scholar, who says that a passion for justice comes from the experience of injustice. And so the bringing up and the early experience that Jesus had as a peasant compared to those of Siddhartha, who became Buddha, who was raised a prince, has a lot to do with that ongoing political, social unrest. In addition, the second factor is that Jesus came from a long line of traditions of Moses and the classical prophets of ancient Israel. all of whom were God-intoxicated voices of religious, social protest. Social protest has been going on for centuries and shall continue as long as there are people doing things of harm to others. There will be others, God willing, who stand to say no more. And so, as we have studied the parallels of Jesus and Buddha, there are many speculations as to why their teachings are so similar. And yet, it really doesn't matter, because throughout human history, there have been multiple individuals who have risen up to be wise sages, prophets, and avatars. Regarding Jesus and Buddha, both shared from their personal sacred experience, their personal awakening, and each shared the way that they had traveled. They each shared that all of us will have and can have a very similar awakening. We can all have this experience. And my prayer is that you do. Namaste.